غمض عينيك وتذكر
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. I want to begin by thanking the Norbury Muslim Center and its organizers, including Brother Osman Qureshi, for the generous invite to the community. I'm deeply humbled to be with you today, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses the gathering and enables me to provide some benefit. As a disclaimer, and I always give this disclaimer when I'm here, this is actually my third day in England. And so although I'm learning more and more about it, my cultural context as an American is quite different than yours, and some of my references, how I intend to certain questions, may not speak to or be immediately pertinent to yours. And so forgive me in advance for that. Bismillah. In June 1970, America's first gay pride parade hit the streets. 4 U.S. cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco, hosted crowds ranging from several hundred to a few thousand, marching with homemade signs declaring pride, power, and liberation. Just 2 years later, on July 1st, 1972, the UK's first Pride March was held in London, with approximately 200 participants. The date was chosen as the closest Saturday to the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which took place on June 28, 1969. Roughly 34 years later, London was host to a Euro Pride event in 2006. This time, over 600,000 participated. The question before us today is what happened? How did we go from a small movement that barely attracted 200 people in the 1970s to take to the street, a society that was at home with a firm public and social commitment to heterosexual marriage, to one where pride flags are draped in front of our coffee shops, are bandied in front of shops and buildings, and where LGBT teachings are now viewed as essential to the formation of a good person? That question itself is pertinent and worthy of exploring. And for the purpose of today's talk, I want to focus on helping us understand and comprehend the discourse that surrounds and dominates the LGBT movement. Because the people who do not understand a movement can hardly hope to resist its advances or engage with it thoughtfully. On this account, I will be focusing my talk on 2 specific questions. The first of these questions is what homosexuality actually is. And this first question is quite a loaded question that will take us some time to get through. It will form the vast majority of what I speak about today. Because in talking about homosexuality, we're not only talking about sex, but about identities, questions about how sexuality emerges, debates over nature versus nurture, and more. The second question I will transition into is a perhaps more practical question of what we can do to help our communities and young people engage with this debate more fruitfully, speaking specifically about how our moral commitments can be translated in the culture and society we inhabit. Starting off with homosexuality, there's an axiom in Islamic law that says al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. The ruling on something is predicated on a proper conceptualization of what that thing is. The meaning of that is that one can't pass religious judgment on something until they have a reasonable understanding of what it is that they're talking about. You can't judge on something that you don't know or you don't understand. When we speak of homosexuality today, that becomes especially challenging. We're often speaking of and connoting multiple things at once. And for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to limit it to 4 major things here for the purpose of time. The first of these is that we're speaking of desires that an individual feels, specifically sexual desire towards the same sex. Moreover, we're often accepting that desire is something essential to the person, that the desires that people feel, are a byproduct of nature. They were born this way, or possess certain gay genes perhaps, or something of that sort. The second thing that we're speaking of is homosexual behaviors. These are actions that an individual takes on. The third thing that we're speaking of is a lifestyle that people conform to, often inclusive of a broader gay subculture, a community, quote unquote, to which that person belongs, a way of understanding him or herself in the world, and more. And then finally, we're speaking of an identity that people have chosen to internalize and adopt as essential to who they are and how they see themselves. This concept of homosexuality presents multiple challenges for us as Muslims at the most basic level of understanding what it is, because each of those topics has to be treated separately and independently. Not all carry the same moral gravity, and each has to be responded to carefully in a way that corresponds to the Sharia and Allah's guidance. Beginning with the first, and I'll go one by one. So we'll begin with the question of desires. We have to address here whether or not people dispositionally possess homosexual attractions. And this is something that people state quite often. I was born this way. In a recent protest in Maryland that took place, on a side note, where I live, there was a group of LGBT and gay advocates that came out, and they had a song playing that kept repeating "Born This Way," and that was the name of the song, and they were dancing to that song in support of their overall movement. So what we can state here about that question confidently is a few things. For one, we can state that there is no definitive biological marker for homosexual inclinations and desires. In 2016, The New Atlantis published a study after its authors carefully reviewed over 500 scientific articles and concluded, among other things, and I'm quoting from them directly, that the understanding of sexual orientation as an innate, biologically fixed property of human beings, the idea that people are born that way, is not supported by scientific evidence. Studies have suggested at times genetic or biological correspondence, but there has been nothing definitive or deterministic. And at most, one might say that perhaps certain biological factors contribute to it, but they don't form the entire story. They have to be coupled with environmental factors, which are many and not fully understood well. To be clear, in refuting the idea of biological determinism or nature forcing people into homosexual attractions, what we are not saying is that everyone who feels homosexual attractions chooses those attractions. In fact, we can concede that some, perhaps even many or most, don't make any such choice. And if provided the choice, would have chosen not to have had those attractions. Nevertheless, it's important to note here that the idea of sexual desire being an inherent born this way feature is not supported by any reputable or credible science. Having said that, the question we can proceed to ask on the question of desire is whether certain desires are bad or wrong. On this, we can say a few things. Allah has endowed all of us with certain desires which, if acted upon, are sinful. And when those thoughts emerge in our minds, we are taught to stifle them at the root. Because when thoughts linger, they become things that we fantasize over. And when we fantasize over things, our hearts begin to act, and then our limbs follow suit. Slowly and surely, we see one domino fall after another. So those thoughts are bad if we let them control us, though they also represent opportunities of reward if and when we resist. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in the Quran that this life is a test. And He describes it Himself saying, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ. He is the one who created death and life. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ. In Surah Al-Mulk, He says that He created death and life to test you, to see which of you is best in deeds. And He is the exalted in might, the forgiving. Elsewhere, He says in Surah Al-Ankabut, أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. do people think that they will be left to say, we believe, and that they will not be tried. He says in the next verse, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ فَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ. Says, but we have certainly tried those before them, and Allah will surely make evident those who are truthful, and He will surely make evident the liars. In a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِذَا حَبَّ اللَّهُ قَوْمًا إِبْتَلَاهُم. When Allah loves a people, He tests them. فَمَنْ رَضِيَ فَلَهُ الرِّضَى وَمَنْ سَخِطَ فَلَهُ السَّخْطُ. أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. And whoever is pleased with that test and endures through it, for them is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whoever detests it, for him is Allah's displeasure. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that hell is surrounded by temptations of this world. حُفَّتِ الْجَنَّةِ بِالْمَكَارِهِ. The Prophet ﷺ said that paradise is surrounded by things that are difficult for people. وَحُفَّتِ النَّارِ بِالشَّهَوَاتِ. And the hellfire is surrounded by things that are tempting, Moreover, when it comes to fleeting thoughts, the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, and this hadith is reported by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ said in a very famous hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَتَبَ الْحَسَنَاتِ وَالسَّيِّئَاتِ, that verily Allah has recorded good and bad deeds. ثُمَّ بَيَّنَ ذَلِكَ, and He has made them clear. And He says, فَمَنْ هَمَّ بِحَسَنَةٍ, whoever intends, has a hum, to do something good, فَلَمْ يَعْمَلْهَا, and they don't do it, they just have the intention to do it, كَتَبَهَا اللَّهُ عِنْدَهُ حَسَنَةً كَامِلَةً, they get the reward of a complete good deed. وَإِنْ هَمَّ بِهَا فَعَمِلَهَا, and whoever has the intention to do so and acts upon it, كتبها الله عز وجل عنده 10 حسنات إلى 700 ضعف إلى أضعاف كثيرة. Then he says that if he does it, Allah will record that good deed and multiply it by 10 up to 700 times or even more. So when someone does a good deed, only Allah knows how many times it's going to be rewarded. Now he juxtaposes this with someone who intends to do something evil. وَإِنْ هَمَّ بِسَيِّئَةٍ, if he intends to do a bad deed, and then he doesn't act on it, فَلَمْ بِهَا فَعَمِلَهَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَ عِنْدَهُ 10. So I'll just read it. So if he intends to, because the Arabic got mixed up on it, but if he intends to do a bad deed and he does not do it, فَلَمْ يَعْمَلْهَا, then Allah will record for him one complete good deed. And if he does it, so he now intends to do a sin and he acts on it, he says Allah will record for him a single bad deed. سَيِّئَةً وَاحِدَةً. And this hadith is muttafaq alayh. So the only way that Allah gives someone a complete bad deed is when they intend to do it and they act on it. But if someone intends to do a sin and they don't act on it, then they don't receive the sin for that. Now, so here we see the effect of having good thoughts. Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah, he has a lengthy commentary on this hadith. It's in his sharh of the 40 hadith of An-Nawir. And so it's a good book if people want to check that out, especially that section. But it should be noted here that when it refers to someone not acting on a sin that they have thought about, that the thought came into their mind, we're speaking of someone who resists that sin for proper reasons. Not because they were incapable of doing the sin or something. I wanted to go and sin, but the car broke down, so khalas, I can't do it. No, there's no reward in that. Someone who actually fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and realizes that they shouldn't act on that sin. In any case, what stands out for our purposes is when someone experiences homosexual thoughts, fleeting thoughts, is to remind them that the thoughts themselves are things to be resisted, and that there is a tremendous opportunity for reward in being from those who Allah describes as وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ, those who protect and guard their chastity. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from them. Now, after desire, we transition into behaviors or actions. On this count, we say firmly and categorically that homosexual acts are sinful. And indeed, male homosexual behavior, sodomy, is a grave sin, just the same way zina is a grave and major sin. And to this, we might remind a person of a few things. Firstly, that the Sharia has certain encouragements to block off the means to sin. Sadda dhari'a, the scholars say, you block the means. If a person finds that he or she is tempted to sin in certain settings, then those settings are better avoided. And by the way, this is a rule for everybody. Everybody. Likewise, avoiding private and close company with someone who you are highly attracted to or feel attraction towards, lowering your gaze, fasting, these are all clear imperatives in Allah's book and the Prophet's Sunnah alayhi salatu wassalam. On the off chance that someone ends up succumbing to their desires and sinning, we remind people that a grave sin, even a major sin, short of any sin, short of the sins of shirk and kufr, do not take someone outside of the fold of Islam. A sinner, in other words, is still Muslim, provided he does not reject Allah's guidance, try to do istihlal, or reject the sinful nature of the sin itself. We also remind all believers who sin that the doors of Allah's grace and mercy are open. In a hadith in the Sunnah of An-Nisa'i, Ibn Abbas, he reports that there were a group of people, أَنَّ قَوْمًا كَانَ قَتَلُوا فَأَكْثَرُوا وَزَنَوْا فَأَكْثَرُوا. He said that there were a group of people, they used to kill others, and they did so a great deal. And he said, and they used to commit adultery, and they did a great deal of it. And then he said, فَأَتَوْا إِلَى النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم. They came to the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. They said, Ya Muhammad, O Muhammad. They said that what you call to, la hasan, we find what you're calling to good, that there is good in it. But is there anything in it that can give us an expiation, a kafara for the sins that we've done in the past? And he says that after this, Allah revealed a few verses, including the verse where he says, Azza wa Jal, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. Very famous verse of the Quran where Allah says, say, O my slaves who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair or lose hope in the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. And this was in response to Ibn Abbas, where he asked this question about where these people came, and they asked the Prophet ﷺ about their sinful past. I mention this because it's important that we remember that we are a community of people who sin. The Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُ الْخَطَّائِينَ التَّوَّابُونَ. The best of those who sin are those who repent. Major sins are forgivable by sincere repentance. One has to feel remorse for their sin, have a resolution not to return to their sin, and they ask Allah for help and support in doing so. So that's where we come to actions. This is how we address actions. Now, from actions, we begin talking about the question of lifestyle. And we remind people that who we surround ourselves with is significant and not a trivial matter. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, الرجل على دين خليله فلينظر أحدكم من يخالف. Prophet ﷺ said that a man is on the religion of his friends, so let him be careful who he befriends. In the Quran, Allah tells us of those who express regret over the friends they took in this world. And they wished they could go back to this world so that they can dissociate from them. Allah says in the Quran, وَيَوْمَ يَعَدُّ الظَّالِمُ عَلَى يَدَيْهِ يَقُولُ يَا لَيْتَنِي اتَّخَذْتُ مَعَ الرَّسُولِ سَبِيلًا يَا وَيْلَتَى لَيْتَنِي لَمْ أَتَّخِذْ فُلَانًا خَلِيلًا. And the day the wrongdoer will bite on his hands in regret. And he will say, oh, I wish I had taken with the messenger away. Woe to me. I wish I had not taken this person as a friend. لَقَدْ أَضَلَّنِي عَنِ الذِّكْرِ بَعْدَ إِذْ جَاءَنِي وَكَانَ الشَّيْطَانُ لِلْإِنسَانِ خَذُولًا. Allah says that this man will say, he led me away from the remembrance after it had come to me, and ever is Satan to man a deserter. Elsewhere in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذْ تَبَرَّأَ الَّذِينَ اتُّبِعُوا مِنَ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوا وَرَأَوُا الْعَذَابَ وَتَقَطَّعَتْ بِهِمُ الْأَسْبَابِ. That when those who have been followed dissociate themselves from those who followed them, and they all see the punishment, and they are cut off from the ties of relationships. وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوا, that those who are following the others, they say, لَوْ أَنَّ لَنَا كَرَّةً, if only we have another chance. If only we have another chance. فَنَتَبَرَّأَ مِنْهُمْ كَمَا تَبَرَّؤُوا مِنَّا, that we would dissociate from them the same way that they're dissociating from us now. And Allah says, كَذَلِكَ يُرِيهِمُ اللَّهُ أَعْمَالَهُمْ حَسَرَاتٍ عَلَيْهِمْ وَمَا هُمْ بِخَارِجِينَ مِنَ النَّارِ. Thus Allah will show them their deeds as regrets upon them, and they are never to leave the fire. Allah says they'll never leave it. When you're adopting a lifestyle that is predicated on surrounding yourself with people who take pride in their sins, you are going to immerse yourself in greater and greater sins. Prophet ﷺ said, مَنْ تَشَبَّهَ بِقَوْمٍ فَهُوَ مِنْهُمْ. Whoever imitates a people is from them. Whoever imitates a people is from them. You begin to dress like them. You talk like them and enjoy how they talk. You begin to take their takes on social life, culture, and politics. And soon, most crucially, you begin to hold their values and beliefs. Finally, we get to what wraps all of these components together, which is the question of identity. Here, not only does a person possess certain desires, and not only does that person behave in certain ways or hang out with certain people, he is now defined by that community, by his actions, by his desires. This is not a person who merely experiences homosexual attractions on occasion, but is instead someone whose fundamental identity is being gay. Imagine, as an example, someone who experiences regular thoughts of adultery and elevates that thought into an identity such that he says, I am an adulterer, and you have to accept me for who I am, or else you're being hateful. This identity is arguably the most toxic part of this entire equation, because it creates a situation in which the Sharia makes no sense to a person. In stating that certain behaviors and acts are haram, the person says, well, you're erasing my very existence. Oftentimes people will respond to religious reminders on this topic with the statement, gay Muslims exist, queer Muslims exist. And we might respond to them by saying, yes, Muslims exist who experience homosexual attractions, and Muslims exist who sin. But a Muslim is not defined by his attractions, let alone his sins. He is defined by his relationship with Allah. Our core identity, what stands paramount for all of us, is that we are Muslim. Allah says in the Quran, مَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا وَقَالَ إِنَّنِي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. Who is better in speech than the one who calls to Allah and does righteous deeds and says, I am from the Muslims. Allah named us Muslim. هُوَ سَمَّاكُمُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. He named you Muslim. No label is more honorable than it. Our religion is predicated on submitting ourselves to Allah, to recognizing that we are His slaves, that we are dependent upon Him for everything in our lives, that we place His guidance before our base desires, even if it is difficult. Unfortunately, with the LGBT movement, you have people who now invoke pride with respect to this identity. They are proud of sinning and transgressing Allah's path. They set up parades where they demonstrate with smut and provocative displays. They teach our young people that being a good person and caring about equality is not only tolerating such behaviors, but allying with these proud, quote unquote, people, and that any reservations they possess whatsoever are just a function of their bigotry and hatred. It needs to be said clearly here that a Muslim cannot take pride in sin. A Muslim cannot form his core identity around sin. That a Muslim may possess other identities of meaning, but those other identities are conditioned and filtered by Islam, not the other way around. To give you a simple example of this, some of us may find meaning in our cultural and ethnic identities. And at a basic level, we may say there's no problem with that. But when that cultural marker demands that you accept sinful conduct or things displeasing to Allah, you say, no, my Lord comes first. My Lord comes first, not this culture that I feel connected to, not this ethnicity that I belong to, but rather my faith, my beliefs, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He comes first. And so what is going on here is a tremendous amalgamation of things that need to be kept separate. Feelings, fleeting thoughts, and desires are in their own category. And as we said, those thoughts, the sort of fleeting thoughts that people have that emerge, provide us an opportunity for reward, and we understand that many of those thoughts that we possess are a test in this world. In this world. Actions fit into their own category. And homosexual acts are sinful, but not kufr. But not kufr. They are not disbelief. And that we urge people to avoid sinful conduct, and that when they sin, to make tawbah and repent on the off chance that they succumb. Finally, identity and lifestyle come in. And here we remind people of their fundamental and primary identity as believers, and we remind them that to surround themselves by people of belief, to be resurrected as part of the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to be in his company alayhi salatu wasalam in the hereafter. So this is the first question that I wanted to address, the question of conceptualization and what it is in fact we're speaking of when we speak of homosexuality. The second question I'll transition to, and I'll be briefer here, is what we can do about all of this. For one, and I have a couple of things that I'm going to mention, but the first one here is I think we have to realize that shaping broader culture, especially in non-Muslim societies, is a hard bargain. We have to recognize our cultural moment and be attuned to what is going on. That means vetting what our children are exposed to, limiting their digital footprint, especially their access to smartphones. It means knowing what they're learning in school and doing what we can to examine alternatives like homeschooling or Islamic schools. The second thing we have to do is speak out. And what I mean by that is that we have to engage this publicly in a manner that is wise and firm. بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْعِظَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ, as Allah says. That we do so with wisdom and beautiful preaching. On the legal front, we need Muslims who are challenging laws that make it more difficult for people of faith to live with Allah's guidance on questions of sex and gender. We also need to resist those efforts that remove parental discretion over their own children. We need to be active at the level of public schools and how curriculums are being formed and changed. We also need to do da'wah. It's not enough to speak against something, but we must actually speak for something better. Show people the beauty of Islam, which includes its socio-familial ethics. Allah tells us in the Quran, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ, let there arise from you an ummah يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, that they call to that which is good. وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, they command that which is good. وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, and they forbid that which is evil. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ, and they are the successful ones. I firmly believe, and Allah knows best, that one of the most important things our young people need is a comprehensive Islamic curriculum that integrates Islamic teachings about homosexuality and transgenderism into a broader treatment of gender and sexual ethics overall. And by that I mean that we teach them about the family and silat al-rahim, maintaining the ties of kinship. We discuss things like hifz al-nasab, preservation of nasab and lineage, and the importance of lineage. By the way, on a side note here, one of the things I find so interesting today is the rise of services that people can pay for to figure out what their ancestry actually is. It's like Ancestry.com has become very popular in the United States. There are services like this. They do like genetic matching or like DNA. They do some sort of sample evaluation. They can tell you where your ethnic heritage is from. And people want to know. This is an important part of the Sharia. Hifd al-Nasab, it's from the maqasid of the Sharia, the higher objectives of Islamic law. We should discuss things like inheritance and how it connects to so much of our bloodline. Silat al-Rahim is reinforced in all of that. And we discuss different concepts. Haya, modesty, iffa, khalwa. Khalwa, you're not staying in the same sort of private company with the opposite gender, lowering the gaze, ghad al-basar, marriage, divorce, male and female differences in the Sharia. All of this comes up, and along the way we're discussing the right way to do things, what the wisdom behind it is, as well as sins and why they're transgressions against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think one of the things that people will come to learn is how beautifully everything fits together. The third thing that we need to do is produce materials that transmit our ethics. We need our own cultural products, books that can be used in Islamic schools, books that our children can read, shows and movies and more that they can watch. Our children cannot grow up in a vacuum with us lecturing them all the time and a madrasa teacher who talks to them here and there. They need to engage with ideas in a way that activates their minds, and we need to encourage them to be creative and exercise their minds in a wholesome and healthy way. This brings me to my next point. We need countercultural spaces where our values are lived and embodied. The importance of the jama'ah cannot be overstated. Allah tells us in the Quran, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَلَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشَلُوا وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ وَاصْبِرُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not dispute with one another, or you will be discouraged and weakened. Persevere, be patient. Indeed, Allah is with those who are patient. The hadith from Abi Tha'laba al-Khushani radiyallahu anh, where he said, كَانَ النَّاسِ إِذَا نَزَلُوا مَنْزِلًا. He said, when the people used to stop at a passageway or a valley, تَفَرَّقُوا فِي الشِّعَابِ وَالْأَوْدِيَةِ. He said the people used to disperse and split up. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن تفرقكم في هذه الشعاب والأودية إنما ذلكم من الشيطان. The Prophet ﷺ witnessed this, and he said that verily you're splitting up, everyone's going in their own way like this. He said, indeed, that is nothing but from shaitan. That is from Satan. He said after this, فَلَمْ يَنْزِلُوا بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ مَنْزِلًا إِلَّا انضَمَّ بَعْضُهُمْ إِلَى بَعْضٍ. He said after that we never stopped at another place except that we would always remain very close. He said such that you could throw a blanket out and you would cover us up. That's how close they would stay. Allah tells us the importance of the jama'ah. The Prophet ﷺ reminds us that the wolf devours the sheep that strays from the flock. Brothers and sisters in Islam, what society are we living in that we think we can do it alone? What is this society that we think we can do it alone? We need to show our children what it means to be good to our parents. Birrul walidain, they need to see it in us. What it means to be good to our elders in the community. We need to show our children what suhbah looks like. Brotherhood and sisterhood, they need to see positive examples of religion being lived among one another. Finally, we need to remind ourselves that human beings are not just minds. We have a soul and we need to nurture that. Praying to Allah for guidance, for help and support, doing our adhkar, reciting the Quran, giving in sadaqah and charity, fasting, even voluntary fasts. These have to be things that we commit to on an ongoing basis. And in doing so, we ask Allah to give us the confidence to stand up for our deen in times where it is unpopular to do so, that He makes us steadfast until our last days, and that He forgive us for our errors and shortcomings. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala al-mursaleen. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allah knows best.
There's an individual that Usman and I both know who sort of came many years ago to express the fact that he had homosexual inclinations to us. And at that time, we tried to, I think, support him through it, really, but not really knowing ourselves really how to do that, because that long ago wasn't that fresh in our community either. And we actually took his case to a group of, shall we say, senior du'at in this country. And at that time, when we presented the case to them, there was ridicule and, you know, like, just disgust really at the mere mention of that. And really what that did is that it set up a narrative in that person's mind. I mean, he didn't hear that himself, but those type of ideas actually gave strength to the fact that, you know, I will never be accepted in this community, I'll never be accepted in society. And then he went down for the next sort of 10 odd years, a path of trying to justify homosexuality from the Nusus, setting up a foundation which supports quote-unquote gay Muslims. So I suppose the question in all of this is, as much as we should be doing activism to counteract the current negative ideologies, how are we changing the whole discourse around how we perceive people in the situation, or the wider Muslim society that's really in, and what the impacts that can have?
Yeah, so I mean, I talked about a little bit about that, about, you know, when we're able to deconstruct the concept and evaluate it in different ways, I think that's very helpful for people. But I'll say a couple of things on this. There have been situations and circumstances where I know of, like, Muslim brothers who experience homosexual thoughts, and they've gone to similar, not necessarily imams' councils, but they've gone to a local imam or something, and they've been advised in certain ways that ultimately didn't help them as much. Where one brother was told, for instance, that he needed to get ruqya done. And so he went to someone where the Quran was recited over him, and they tried for a while and nothing happened. Maybe it'll work for some people, Allah knows, but just it didn't happen for him. And so there have been things like this sometimes that can be demoralizing to the individual, and those types of responses come up. I think the important thing that to do is a couple of things, right? First is to say, okay, if you're experiencing thoughts this way, you don't have to define yourself by them, right? That's not your core identity. Right? In reality, all of us experience thoughts and desires which, if we acted on them, we would be sinful in front of Allah. Really, I mean, we're all sort of in the same boat, at least at that level. Like, we're all in the same boat. We're all experiencing desires, we're all experiencing thoughts that we actually have to stifle. And we have to suppress them, and it's sort of an ongoing mujahada that we live with. And so that may help sort of reduce the exceptionalism, sort of the way that this might be viewed as something unique or exceptional, but to say, look, we're all sort of in this together, even though we recognize that there are some differences here that might make you a bit more unique than the rest of us, it's still something that we're all sort of wrestling with, right? In terms of sort of ongoing care, there are some support groups that have emerged in the past couple of years. There's one in the UK, it's called Strong Support. There's one that's global as well, it's another one, it's called Straight Struggle. They're online groups, people can sign up for them anonymously, they don't have to use their real name. I would suggest people avail themselves of that option. In addition to that, there's a really good podcast series by a brother named Wahid Jensen. He himself experiences homosexual attractions and thoughts, but all these people very, very firmly committed to the Sharia and very critical of the LGBT discourse. He actually goes through this issue almost every conceivable angle. He talks about media narratives, propaganda around it, everything, but he also talks about sort of the first person experience and what people are going through this do. And so A Way Beyond the Rainbow, there's like 80 some episodes. I did 5 episodes with him together as part of it. And so I think that's an exceptional resource that I would tell people to take a look at. Longer term, one of the vacuums that we need to fill is having more Muslims that are trained reasonably well in therapy and counseling, but in a way that coincides more readily with Islam and the Sharia. And the reality is that when people are experiencing something like this, if they go to a therapist, they'll say, you just need to live, you need to be the person you know you are. And any religion that doesn't accept you for who you are is a problem. right? Like this religion is causing you all this anxiety, it's causing you all this stress. Just, if you want to be happy, the answer is simple. You just don't have to be part of that religion anymore, right? And so that sort of affirmative therapy framework obviously is just like paving the path for apostasy. And so you need organizations that are actually on the ground trying to develop something like that. I know some of the brothers at the Quran Institute with Abu Hamza, they have Madad counseling, Madad outreach. They're trying to do that, and they're working on that. Inshallah, perhaps more Muslims will collaborate and try to form those types of things as well, so that Muslims who do have those desires or thoughts will have outlets where they can talk to people that understand this issue from sort of an Islamic frame of mind, but are also qualified and competent, intending to them to help them find a place of wholeness, right? So those are just a couple of thoughts. Allah knows best.
Sorry, can I just come back a little bit? You focused a lot on the individual,
Yeah.
but that individual still feels alienated from society, even if you put them into other groups. It very much feels like you guys are one type of person, and this is, I think, one of the substantive issues that this individual had. He lost the fact that he was part of the Muslim community, but the Muslim community itself deals with those type of people almost like the pariahs, and that sort of exacerbates the situation. So is there something that you could speak about from the communal point of view, the community point of view, that should also be brought into force to help you?
No, well, I mean, we don't want people like walking around out and about out of the closet, right? I mean, our whole point is that like that's not your identity, that's not who you are. In theory, we would have no clue. I mean, I don't meet Muslim brothers and give them salam and ask them, who are you sexually attracted to? Like that's not a thought that's ever caused, like that's not a question that's ever crossed my mind. A person can be a full participant in the Muslim community. They can pray salah, they can fast, they can receive reminders, they can be part of the Tawheed, they can do everything and really feel part of the community without this ever being something that they have to like wrestle with, because it's not like we're trying to seek out people's sort of sexual desires in that way, right? We don't do that. In some ways, like if a person feels insecure about that, they feel insecure about the difference, we need to help them get over it. But in many ways, Muslim communities, some Muslim communities can be surprisingly warm relative to broader society. And I say that in ways that we don't necessarily consider or think of because they're just normal to us. For instance, the idea of hugging somebody, like brothers hugging each other when they meet, right? On Eid. I don't know how it is in the UK. US, Allah knows I hug so many people, I don't even know who they are. Honestly, on Eid, like Salah's done, we're just hugging random people. Eid Mubarak, Eid Mubarak. I don't know 30, 40 people that I've hugged, And that's normal for us. It's not like weird to hug other Muslim brothers. And yet, in broader society, that's not how you greet other men, really. It's looked at as very like kind of homo, right? Like people talk about it like that's kind of gay or something. Like it's a very strange way for people to just show like a regular greeting. Yet for us, that's normal. That's normal. Even sort of the notion of loving your brother for the sake of Allah, the type of connections we can feel. This is something that I think can be very alienating for brothers, is that young men don't have many contacts where they can really develop healthy forms of male bonding and sort of brotherly love, right? And it's different, right? That's not like romantic, erotic love. It's very, like that's not all love is. I remember when I was in high school, I went to a week-long retreat. And this was not like a no-frills type of thing, right? There was nothing to, like, we played a lot of soccer, mashallah. And I guess football, right? We played a lot of football. I'm no good in it, but I just played, right? And then there was Islamic reminders and talks by brothers, and we ate, and the food was okay, alhamdulillah, but, we got a lot of energy out, and we heard a lot of Islamic talks, we prayed salah together, and I can tell you, the last day, when people were leaving, there were a lot of brothers who were in tears. These were kids in high school. The mood was somber and sad because no one wanted to leave. You just loved being with these brothers. You really did. And that wasn't something crazy that we had to like manufacture. You spend time, you pray salah with people, you break bread with them, you talk to them. You really get to love brothers. Really. Prophet ﷺ said, when you love your brother, tell him. Right? That's not like a strange thing for us. So when you talk about a person who says, well, I feel alienated from the community, part of that can be that person's own insecurity, which we can't do anything about. If that person wants to come here, bismillah. Like, who's going to know? Right? No one's going to ask. Right? You may get asked once in a while, are you married, you have kids, anything like that. Okay, just say no. It's not like a question we sort of pepper people about all the time, right? And so, you can be part of the community, do all sorts of worship, be part of it, and like, inshallah, we can have programs and activities where young people can grow up and really feel sort of sisters feeling the sisterhood, brothers feeling the brother. Like, we need to have very open communities where people are able to experience and live that, and not just be a place where, people don't want to come, right? That's the worst. So. Allah knows best.
I think we spent a little bit of time speaking on homosexuality specifically, and we spoke about your primary identity is not your desires. And I think with homosexuality, because a lot of it is predicated on an act that you want to carry out, and you stem that as much as you possibly can. I just wanted to move to the other, I guess, rainbow-coloured elephant in the room. Transgenderism is slightly different then, I assume. And my main questions then are, in terms of, if a child comes to you now at this point and says, I feel like I'm in the wrong body, etc., etc., what are the steps to deal with that specifically? Like, what's the narrative, what's the story from our side that we have to present? And then secondly, where does it stem from in the first place? I mean, is there such thing as, I don't want to call it a fitri sense, but maybe there's a deformed fitra that has now come out, so he feels very naturally that he is in the wrong body and things, or is it completely socialized? What does the literature actually say in where this comes from? And then that would lead to, like, on a societal communal level, how you deal with it. So sort of familial and then societal as well, in dealing with those transgender issues specifically.
Yeah, so a couple of things. The idea of wrong body is definitely psychosocial. Like, there's no fitri sense of, oh my God, I'm in the wrong body. I mean, that's actually a very strange way to think. Like, no one could have thought, that thought, let me take a step back. I think no one could have had that thought 100 years ago. Because what are you going to do about the body, right? Now you have surgeries and all this, and so the thought of being in the wrong body has emerged, right? And there's a discourse around it and all that. So I think the sort of body dysmorphia part of it is definitely socially conditioned. When it comes to children are generally, their notions of gender is a bit more fluid to begin with, because they're still developing, they're young. I don't think we need to express anxiety when kids do things that we might look at and say, well, that's not like something that's gender typical for them. I don't know, a young boy puts on his mom's hijab or something at home. That doesn't mean he's a girl, right? Or, he just likes praying salah with his mom and suddenly he starts throwing on hijab. Like, that's not, like, we don't have to freak out over things like that. In fact, in studies of childhood sort of gender nonconformity, he said in over 85% of the cases, it just dissipates when children start hitting adolescence anyways. And so even cases that might seem a bit acute, ideas that we can still just, like, we don't have to overreact to it. Instead, we can incorporate more positive development. Maybe that child maybe that boy needs to spend more time around the brothers, who knows, right? Ideas we can sort of respond to that thoughtfully and carefully and sort of shepherd things along. When it comes to non-conforming behavior, there are certain people that have dispositional behaviors that they haven't chosen, but are non-conforming. And in fact, we have categories for these people in the Sharia itself, and in fiqh. You have the mukhannath, and you have the khilqi mukhannath, and you have the ghayr khilqi, but you have the mukhannath khilqi, you have the effeminate male, right? And the ruling on the effeminate male is that, there's things that the scholars point out specifically about the features of the effeminate male is that he may have a voice that sounds feminine. And he's not trying to fake it. He's not lightening his voice. He's not deliberately trying to impersonate women. You hear this man talking and you think, well, that's a woman. Or if you're on the phone, you wouldn't know if it's a male or female, potentially. If he's not deliberately doing that, there's no sin on that. There's no sin associated with him talking. And they say he may also walk in a way with like a sway or something, right? That someone looks at and says that's kind of like a feminine walk. Say that there's no sin on just him walking, provided he's not doing it intentionally. Now, some scholars say that that person has a duty to try to regularize his voice and his walk to the extent that he can. Others say he doesn't have a duty or an obligation to do so. So there's some khilaf on whether or not he's obligated to try to adjust those in any significant way. Nevertheless, on things that the person's just not choosing, say, okay, right? Like there's no moral blame that we assign to the person for that. And the female analog to that is the mutarajila, right? The sort of mannish female. Where if you had a woman that had a very deep masculine voice or things like that, say, okay, there's no sin in that on its own. The sin comes in is when people are deliberately impersonating the opposite gender, or alternatively, even for the mukhannath or the mutarajila, question is, can they do more than that? Does that give them license to suddenly, okay, my voice is high, I walk this way, can I start dressing like a woman? No. Right? That's impermissible because you have the clear hadith of Prophet. Right? That's a clear hadith where the Messenger of Allah has cursed the man who impersonates women, women who impersonates men. So when that's being done deliberately, right, and when it's being done in ways where there's elective choice, right, starts wearing makeup, starts doing this, starts doing that, right, in ways to appear feminine, we say no, all of that is impermissible. But where we have some sort of accommodation or tolerance is a situation where you may in fact have people who have some just dispositional behaviors that are khilqi, that Allah created them with, that they didn't choose, that are not normative for their gender. They're not normative for their gender. And for those people, again, we have no problem. They're male, they have all the rulings of a male, the mukhannath does, mutarajila, all the rulings of a female. And insofar as they have certain characteristics or features that appear to be the opposite gender, so long as that they're not deliberately doing so, we say no problem. There's no moral sin to assign to them. Inshallah, there's no problem there. And Allah knows best.
So this is kind of the next thing on from the transgender kind of movement. So my daughter came home, she's in her late teens, and she came home the other week. She goes to an all-girls school,
Okay.
and she said she found another girl in the corridor who was wearing a tail.
A tail?
A tail, yeah, was wearing a tail, and acting, she was standing by an office and acting in a manner which looked a bit like a cat. And she was wearing the cat, like, she was wearing the tail on going, like this is just part of, it's a uniform school, but she was wearing the tail as part of the behaviour, maybe is what she identifies as. So my question was more about the sort of movement now, because obviously the movements are changing and becoming furry or feline or trans-feline or whatever it might be, and how our approach should be to that movement or any other kind of similar future movement.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not trying to be like cheeky or anything or snide. It's just like people are losing their minds, right? I mean, really, like this is really like really getting out of hand, and that's why as Muslims, like it's important for us to speak out against this because in some ways there's no stopping the snowball. Like it just seems to be growing worse and worse and worse in many cases. Obviously, like we have a clear moral response to something like that. And if someone really believes that, like that person is in need of psychological help, right? We would say that that's a psychosocial problem. They need to be sat down. They need therapy. That like, obviously, we're not going to say that like, I don't know, a trans cat is a cat or something like that, right? Just like we wouldn't say a trans woman is a woman, right? We would deny all of these things. In fact, we would even deny that such a category could exist. And so the extent to which these things grow, it's just going to represent a bigger problem for us. And those things, like, it's just all very strange. It's all very strange. Inshallah, they don't grow too big, but the extent to which they grow, we're just going to have to speak out against it, and that's all we can do, honestly. And if they do grow, they start representing challenges for us in other spaces. How much accommodations do we now have to give to this trans cat or something? How do teachings have to get adjusted to start accounting for this trans? I mean, I don't know. Like these are all like this is where the movement goes every single time, and so it's really important for us to push back in the early stages. If your daughter goes to school with that, I mean, I would honestly talk to school administrators and say, what's going on here? Really, what's going on here? Like I don't think that's unreasonable for a parent to wonder about. Hey, there's a student that's walking around with a tail. Like, was it Halloween? What's going on? Like, why is this, and this is happening every day? Is she okay? Is she getting help? I have no problem with my daughter seeing it, but like, I do have a problem with it being an ongoing thing that we're all going to, have a pretense over as if this is normal, right? Like as if that's normal, right? And that's the type of thing that, that's about as best as we can do right now. Allah knows best.
Maybe we have a question or two from sisters now.
In Islam, what is the understanding about people who in certain cultures are called transgenders? Is there really people who are born other than man and women, identities by Allah, and how do we deal with such people?
So Jazakallah khair. So we don't have anyone that's born with identities other than man or man. We do have a category of the Sharia of people who are biologically androgynous, and that is the khuntha mushkil. And so that's where you have a human being that possesses both male and female organs, reproductive organs, and is sufficiently ambiguous such that we don't know what gender that person is in a easy to detect way. Now, I'll take a step back because this is a very, very, very rare phenomenon. Very rare. In fact, what people today often refer to as intersex conditions incorporates a huge range of conditions that are not gender ambiguous. So people may have certain gender abnormalities that are subject to surgical or medical correction, or in spite of those, they are predominantly and unambiguously male or female. And there's a huge range of intersex conditions. It covers a lot of people, where many of those, in fact, are gender unambiguous conditions. Insofar as these people are male or female, but they possess certain things that are not normal for their specific gender. When it comes to this small sliver, however, that is sort of gender ambiguous all the way down, there's a huge corpus of fiqh and tradition that speaks to the rulings associated with the khuntha mushkil. There's a paper that I wrote summarizing the rulings on the khuntha. It's available on Muslim Matters. It's called "The Male is Not Like the Female," and it's part 1. So I have a 2-part paper, but part 1 deals with the khuntha, the mukhannath, and the mutarajjila. So if you just read the part 1 of that, inshallah, you'll get a lot more details specifically on the khuntha. And Allah knows best.
Okay, yeah, can we hold up another question? Just from the brothers. Actually, can we just take that from the brother with the green cap first, because he hasn't asked for it.
First of all, children are children, so they learn to rebel, aren't they? So we've got to not forget we have a responsibility to understand that we were all children once. So we all might rebel by trying to leave the front gate. I don't has front gates anymore, but you try to go out and stay out for 5 minutes more than your parents wanted you to, or take an extra sweet lolly when you weren't meant to, and go to the fridge and take your cream. So children by their nature rebel because they want to push the boundaries. So we've got to understand that context. But one of the challenges I'm seeing, and again I don't know about in America, but post-COVID, we send our kids to ground schools and single-sex closed schools because as Muslims we were told, if you send them to single-sex schools, that's your solution because your daughters will be protected from the predators that are boys. Then our boys will be protected from whatever. We've now almost created a perfect storm for ourselves because we're sending them to these schools who are then really pushing their minds and thoughts with the latest ideologies and whatnot. And at the same time, they're now predicating that actually you can't go to these schools unless you have an iPad. You have to have a phone. And you have all of these things. And as parents, we're just saying, okay, lovely, because it's a prestigious school, and we're just going to do it. Where's the pushback from parents? Question.
That was kind of like a comment, so Jazakallah khair. But I mean, I agree with all of that. I'll just add to that I think that that parents need to be very aware, as I mentioned, about the things that their kids are being exposed to. But it's also about, when we talk about jama'ah and raising our kids as part of a larger community, it's not just about speaking about the values, but it's about reinforcing them in a really meaningful way. So one of the things I've mentioned previously, in the United States, I think it exists in the UK elsewhere, there are different philosophies of education. I believe one school system is called the Waldorf system of education. They actually make parents sign a contract to put their kids in the schooling environment, and that contract is a lifestyle contract. And the lifestyle contract includes stipulations like our kids will not have a smartphone, for instance. They won't have a video game system. They won't have these things before they're 17 or 16 or whatever. Like, they actually have things like that. So that kids who are coming in, you don't have some kids that don't, some kids that do, but all of us are agreeing that this is what we are putting in place. So I think even for Islamic schools, places where we have a bit more creative control, those are the types of things that we should try to do. We have spaces where kids have other kids that inshallah share their values, but they're also being raised in ways where they're not digital addicts and overexposed to not just this, but a ton of other stuff at really young ages. So Allah knows best.
Can I just add to that? I've mentioned it a few times, but I'll just say it one more time. There's a school, it's in Northern Hall Park actually. It's a branch of a school based in Gloucester. It started off there. They have a commitment with the parents, right, that children won't use tech until after their 16th birthday, right? So you have a group of people who really aren't even religious, but they understand the harmful effects that technology in its various forms is having on young minds, and they've made a commitment as a community that they're going to observe that, I think, right? Certainly that's what I was told. So really it just depends on how we understand the problem and what steps we're willing to take. I mean, in some ways, from what Ustadh Mobeen has said, the horse has already bolted and sort of running right down the racetrack already, right? So whether we can catch up with it or not is probably not a question. What can we do now? What are we prepared to do now under the circumstances? Anyway, I've got Sheikh Maqbool, I've got a question from the sisters before I come to you. So the question is, if a teenager gets involved in homosexual activity and he's not regretful and he's got younger siblings at home, what should the parents do to help him, but at the same time prevent the younger siblings from being affected?
Yeah, so that's complicated, especially if he's not regretful and he's rebelling a little bit. You don't cut off relationships with your own children, right? So you have to keep trying. You have to keep trying with your kids. But I don't know that there's any prescriptive approach here. In some ways, I could say, hey, take him to a Muslim counselor who understands, the Sharia and is very good at therapy and all that. But if the person's resistant to doing that, and depending on how old the kid is, he may not necessarily even need to listen, right? And so all I'll say is that you know your own children better than I do. So depending on the child, there may be different types of interventions that work. Some of them may be more drastic, some of them may be less so. We can't always socially engineer outcomes. We don't control people's minds in that way. We remember that Allah controls hearts and Allah controls minds, and so we make dua to Him definitely for our children, that He protects them and preserves them. But Allah tells us, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ, that you don't guide whom you love. You don't guide who you love. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِي مَن يَشَاءُ, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides whomsoever He wills. And one of the most difficult tests Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can put anybody in this life through is the test of a child that grows up and leaves the path. It really is. Wallahi, the amount of stress, anxiety, the difficulty that a person can go through. There are few things in life more difficult than that. And so, we really need to do what we can. And I just feel personally, it's a tremendous amount of compassion for such families. And it's something that we're all dealing with. We're all dealing with this. We're trying as hard as we can. We work as hard as we can. Sometimes our kids go off the path and there's nothing that we can say. It just seems like we're trying and trying and trying, and they've just closed themselves off to us. In other situations, perhaps they're straying, perhaps they're straight, but they haven't fully left yet, or they're still giving us an opportunity to remain engaged with them, to remind them. And whenever they give us that opportunity, we should take advantage of it. We should take advantage of talking to them. We should try to maintain that relationship with them. Don't just cut things off, because you don't know when a person who seems like a lost cause might return. You don't know when that person might return. So you want to make clear to the rest of the kids that it's not okay. You want to reinforce that, but you also want to try very hard not to give up on one kid just because that kid has lost the path. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide all of our children. And Allah knows best.
Yes. Jazakallah khair for your insightful talk. Obviously LGBT transgenderism is a manifestation of a much wider problem, which is liberalism, which in itself has been adopted by Muslims in the establishment of a very self-serving Islam, very individualistic. So I think we need to look at the wider malaise, which this is symptomatic of. But I mean, and then secondly, in your research, did you, as many argue, find that homosexuality has always had a footprint throughout Islamic history, and there are examples of sort of Arabic poetry during the various khulafa where the poet is eulogizing the beauty of the young male in the same way that the Greeks did before. And in modern day Indian subcontinent, there are the presence of individuals who dress as women and are sort of tolerated and have always been there, although on the fringes of society. So homosexuality has had a presence, appears to have been accepted, not accommodated, but had a presence. It's in literature, and therefore, are we in danger of creating a moral panic about LGBT, accepting that they have amplified their position, but they are allowed to amplify because there is a bigger attack on Islamic values, which is being spearheaded by this movement, but it's the kind of liberalism, and how do you balance all those factors in the excellent awareness raising and exposition work that you've been doing?
Jazakallah khair for the question. So there's a lot in that. So obviously, liberalism itself is a problem, right? And there are some good and an increasing number of critiques that are being written against liberalism. Stanley Fish has been writing for years. He has a good paper, Why Liberalism Doesn't Exist. Patrick Deneen, his recent book is actually quite good on this topic, as are others. And so there are more critiques of liberalism that are coming out by the day. There are also good critiques now that are emerging against secularism, and they're drawing on previous critiques that have been made, even those from McIntyre, Charles Taylor, others. So there's a good corpus of literature that I think Muslims can draw on to advance a better notion of sort of how we can look at an ethical and moral society, and how social organizing should be done, and so on. So that's definitely there, and I agree with you. And I think that those are the type of things that Muslims need to engage with more. Certainly, in addition to just trying to address these issues at a surface level. On a side note, and I mentioned this in the group, that Dr. Sharif Al-Tubji, inshallah, will have his Sapiens Institute online course coming out, hopefully within the next month. It's a free online course, people can sign up for it. There's an entire section in that course on worldviews, and so that's very, very helpful in understanding some of these issues and topics, as well as where the divergences exist between sort of our worldview as Muslims and sort of the modern worldview, and its ontological, its epistemological, its anthropological assumptions, and so on. Setting that to the side, when it comes to Islamic history, the big person who's written a lot on this is Khalid al-Ruwayhib. He has a book, I think it's entitled something like Before Homosexuality in Medieval Islam, or something like that, in the medieval Arab and Muslim world. What was quite predominant I don't want to say predominant, but certainly existed at some level in Muslim societies historically, was the presence of what they refer to as amrad infatuations, which is romantic infatuations with young, sort of prepubescent boys. And so we're talking about boys that were aged probably 9 to 12. And that is something that you do have poetic, belletristic works and poetic literature that praised. Abu Nawas and others, they tend to get brought up quite a bit about this. Nevertheless, that's something that scholars wrote against and about, right? There's never a time in which scholars looked at that and were sort of soft on that issue. The extent to which they wrote on it was to warn people against it and to condemn it. And one might also say that that didn't exist as like a public identity. It wasn't trying to challenge the moral discourse of society as a whole. It wasn't trying to produce a cultural program. It wasn't trying to march itself in the streets as like a parade thing. It didn't develop its own symbols. Like none of those things happened. And yet all of those things and more are happening constantly here, which is why we have to talk about it. And that's why I think like relative to, I'll take a step back. I think when people talk about this issue and they talk about the responses of religious communities, I always find it interesting because I say, well, like we're not the one who made this issue a top priority. We're not the one who introduced this topic in schools. We didn't start making movies about it. We didn't make cartoons about it. We didn't start shoving it in everyone's faces. We're just now responding in a way that's arguably very mild relative to how large this has grown, and we're doing so simply in order to defend and maintain our beliefs. That's all we're trying to do. And a lot of times people look at that and say, oh my God, look at how much you guys are focusing on this. And like most people who care about issues like this actually say, well, we're actually not focusing that much on it at all, right? They're focusing on it all the time. It's virtually inescapable. And yet for us, we actually don't discuss it that much. And yet we're seeing the impact that it's having on the ground. And that certainly, so there's a lot of disanalogies with that sort of historical thing. Likewise, one might look at the Hijra community in sort of the Indian subcontinent. There are other sort of non-conforming communities in places like Indonesia with the Wariyas. These are socially different phenomena, both in the sense that a Hijra does not believe he is a man in a woman's body, right? That's not like inherent in that belief, and they're complicated. They're complicated phenomena. Some of those people were abducted as children. Many of them have been castrated. I mean, these aren't like Sharia programs we're looking at or something that's Islamically acceptable. In some ways, some of the people that you look at, certainly in these situations, you can look at with a great deal of pity, right? They have to live and subsist through prostitution. They get raped a lot. I mean, there's a lot that goes on there. There are a number of superstitions surrounding them. So, for instance, in the sort of India, Pakistan, places like that, there are a lot of people hold the superstition that it's bad luck to be buried next to a hijra. And so when they die, oftentimes there's no janazah that's prayed for them. They have to get buried at nighttime. There are a lot of these types of things that exist associated with these peoples. And so, they're complicated issues. They're very complex phenomenon. We don't have something like that here. In some ways, we might say, okay, if there are people who practice homosexual behaviors, and there have been people historically who have done so, but they're not trying to marshal that into a big public identity, or they're not doing it in a way that's discernible to us, meaning it's not like a major social current. Well, if people sin privately, we're not sort of obligated to seek out their private sins, right? We're not obligated to seek out their private sins. When they make it a public matter, however, that's when we have no choice, right? And that's in fact where the Sharia steps in as well. That's where the Sharia steps in, the hudud, all of the penalties. It relates to sort of the public and social visibility of sin and trying to create a social climate that is ethical and moral. And that's just a few thoughts on that. On the Amrad note, there is a bit that I wrote specifically on that topic in a long article that I have. You don't have to read the whole thing, but there's a section specifically on this. And it's an article called Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts? It's a response to a book called Homosexuality in Islam by Scott Kugel. It's available at Muslim Matters, and inshallah you'll find some more detail on that topic if you're interested. Allah knows best.
Just a question that sometimes comes up, and I know that I've been asked before, I just wondered how you would answer it. Some Muslim intellectuals, let's call them that, make an argument that the crime of the people of Lut alayhi salam was that they were inhospitable to their guests. Okay, so that it wasn't actually to do with sodomy, but in hospitality. What's the answer to that point?
Yes, so I addressed that argument also in the same article, but briefly, the Quran doesn't support it. Right? Qawm Lut is brought up a handful of times in the Quran. Just about every single time they're brought up, the emblematic sin is very clear. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ رِجَالْ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. These are such clear and unambiguous words. You come to men with sexual desire instead of women. That's it. That is their emblematic sin that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings up with respect to them almost every time they're mentioned. Almost every time they're mentioned. So, the idea of inhospitality is very far-fetched, simply because, you only have the story of the guests, that are staying with Lut alayhi salam, right? The angels that come in the form of handsome men. And even when they come, right? Lut alayhi salam looks at them and says, هَؤُلَاءِ بَنَاتِي هُنَّ أَطْهَرُ لَكُمْ. Right? That these are my daughters, they're purer for you. He directs them towards women. He doesn't direct them to, okay, like you're just being inhospitable because these are my guests at my home. Go do this among yourselves. Or find these other guys. Why are you chasing these 3 handsome men? He says no. Like your attraction should be directed towards women, not men. And so the notion of like they're just being inhospitable, I think a very, very far-fetched narrative and is entirely unsupported in the Quran, and in fact is contradicted by it time and again. And Allah knows best.
Just a question here. Sorry, is it Dr. Adnan?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Just a point I was going to make, which is linked to Dr. Usman's link, and also what this other brother mentioned. Don't also despair in the fact that our kids, mashallah, they're quite rebellious. Okay, I think that trans feline thing actually is linked to, it went viral on social media, is that there were kids who actually were challenging their own teachers. I think it was in Portsmouth regarding this, saying, well, can I identify as a cat? Okay, so I do think that we should realize it's not just about us getting into panics. If that school now has a trans cat movement, that's different, but I think genuinely it's picking up on these social cues that are around, and actually, these kids, like I said, I know this is recorded, I won't describe some of the things that have happened, I know them personally from my own family, but kids by their nature are rebellious, and their fitra is very much that they know these things are wrong, and we need to empower them to know that that's the case. Some of the things you mentioned, the second point, which is the question I've got, is more difficult, is you've gone through, mashallah, the points related to homosexuality and tendencies. And I have had questions directed to me, which is that parents aren't stupid either, so they are aware of these things, and they will ask whether it is permissible for their son or their daughter, who they know have these tendencies, to be married off. And is there an obligation on those parents who know this to actually, well, what is their role? I don't know, because it's not, you've already said, it's not the kind of question that you discuss when you meet brothers and sisters, but in this situation, if you are a parent and you have a prospective sort of thing that if you are aware that your son or daughter has issues, what is your obligation as a parent to that other family?
Yes, so it's a good question. So I think if you are aware, I think it's something that you discuss with your children. You certainly don't want to pressure your children into a marriage, if you are aware of that. I will say that there are certain people who do have homosexual desires, predominantly or exclusively, that have managed to get married. In fact, the brother who leads the straight struggle group is married and he has children. Right? So some have managed to do that. It's not for everybody, obviously. Not everyone's going to be capable of that. Some perhaps might. But I would say that pressuring them into like a premature early marriage is probably not the right move. I think if marriage does happen, it has to happen very, very carefully, and there are probably many things that need to be taken into account. Not least of which is, okay, like how do we actually raise awareness of this with a prospective suitor, prospective spouse that we're actually willing to talk to, right? If there's a willingness there, then we need to be able to discuss that, hey, that person has to be at a wholesome and sort of healthy mental and psychological state such that they're entering it of their own volition. They understand what's going on, and then both sides are everybody's sort of above board, right? And we're not smuggling something that could be potentially catastrophic for the relationship just under the table, right? I think that could definitely be damaging and traumatic for everyone involved, and so I think it's unfortunate because sometimes parents who do suspect that will push a child into marriage and make it a very big issue, so much so that the child will feel like he or she has no choice. And then suddenly that person is in a situation where at some point it just completely, the house just comes falling down, right? And that can be very damaging for the person. And so, again, going back to some of the recommendations, Wahid Jensen has a podcast where he actually talks about this specific topic itself. And I would refer to it simply because he provides a first-person perspective on this issue. And I think he's quite good when he talks about how people can go about deliberating some of these situations. So, Allah knows best.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes and 2 questions. You're one of those questions, I think, yeah? But I've got just one, and just briefly, Ustadh, yeah, how do you navigate around the fact that LGBTQ people are more sympathetic, or so it seems, are more sympathetic to humanitarian and Islamic causes?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. So again, just taking a step back, you'd say that people who identify as LGBT, right? That's not like who they are. That's just how they're identifying. But nevertheless, people who ascribe themselves to that label or that movement at times appear to be more empathetic towards Muslims and others. Who knows? Like a variety of other causes that we might look at and say, well, they care about this, they care about that. Okay, well, just because a person is sinful in one aspect of his or her life doesn't mean that they are just rooted in evil in every single thing that they do, right? People can have redeemable qualities in some domains of life while being, sinful in others, right? You can say the same thing about people, we see this every day. We have people who commit shirk, but are nice and kind and maybe care about a lot of humanitarian causes too. It doesn't mean that shirk isn't a major sin. It doesn't mean that it doesn't carry major theological gravity. It doesn't mean that it's something that's not forgivable. Even people who promote shirk might care about the environment or something. It doesn't make environmentalism less of a cause, and it doesn't make shirk more justifiable. It's a dynamic where we can say, okay, the fact that there's an individual who cares about environmentalism, we look at environmentalism on principle and say that that's a meritorious and valuable thing to do, right? And the reason we think that way is because this world is not ours just to exploit, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us stewards in this world with certain duties and responsibilities, and not to exploit his environment and usurp and do israf and all of these types of things, but rather to be responsible caretakers of the world that we're in. And so we can look at something like that, people who are compassionate towards animals and all of the rest, right? We have a sunnah where the Prophet ﷺ tells us about how to treat animals, and we see a lot of compassion from the Prophet ﷺ towards animals, right? We do. And so we can look at those various things and say that on principle, those are good things to do. And if people do them, well, that's a great thing for them that they're doing it. But nevertheless, we're not allowing their good behavior, good acts, or good conduct in certain spheres of life to allow us to over-determine our view of them such that we're ignoring their problems, right? And people can do the reverse. People can do the reverse too, where we'd say, okay, someone has good belief, he's a Muslim, mashallah, the aqeedah is very good, but we're just going to ignore all of his bad conduct, bad behavior, just because the belief is right. We'd say no, that's not how our religion works. Our religion, we have iman and we have amal, right? People believe and they do good deeds. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Allah says, except for those who believe and they do good deeds. Those are our marching orders. That's our prerogative. That's what we're supposed to do. And so, the question will come up sometimes where people say, well, this person is such a good person, but they don't believe, right? Shouldn't this person go to Jannah or something like that? And we'd say, no, that presupposes that we only have duties toward other human beings, and that in this life we have no duties towards God. And we do have duties towards God. We have duties towards God. Allah has rights over us. Other human beings have rights over us. And Allah tells us, Inna shirka la dhulmun adhim. The greatest injustice, oppression, is shirk. And likewise about these other sins. We'd say, okay, like these people may in fact have redeemable qualities in certain aspects of life, and that's good. But they have this other major moral failing, which they have made a huge symbol of their life, and they constantly express. And so even if I might be able to sort of look at some of those other things and say, well, that's good, the fact that they've allowed this other thing to completely eclipse everything else in such an aggressive way gives me caution and pause, and allows me to realize that I cannot be soft on sin just because people are good in other ways. And Allah knows best.
So, last question, please.
I had a different question, but it changed as you were speaking. One of the things we get with students and things, Karima and myself personally, is now they're going to school with children, or maybe even people go to work with people that are homosexual, transgender, and they ask you, how do I deal with these people? What do I do? Can I be friends with them? And also, like, even in terms of being able to put forward like a therapeutic dawah, because especially somebody who's transgender, even transitioning and things, you have to be very spiritually broken. You spoke about pitying the hijrah.
Yeah.
There is even a sense of pity for people who are going through, they've been manipulated, co-opted by a very demonic movement. They're removing parts of their own body for the sake of this deluded belief that somehow overcome them completely. How do you deal with these people when you actually meet them, when you're in their presence, when you're at school with them, working with them, and when they walk among you and you see them every day?
Yeah, so I think it depends on context. It's a sort of question of relationship. At the end of the day, you sort of accord to people basic respect and basic human dignity that every human being has, right? So we have certain sort of duties on us to be respectful, to be just with people, right? Now, how we relate to people is going to differ based on how they are. There are some people who may show enmity to us, our beliefs, our values, and our faith. To those people, we are not obligated to be kind to them, loving, to give them gifts, to talk to them as if they're our best friends. We don't need to extend any of that. To the average person we meet, we might say, okay, we just deal with them as we would deal with anybody else, right? If there are colleagues in the workplace, if there are colleagues in school, whatever, they're just classmates. They're just people that we're working with. We have certain tasks that we're trying to focus and accomplish, and we're going to be kind to them and get whatever we need to get done. The question of friendships is a sort of broad question because that term is used very loosely today, right? I have like 5,000 Facebook friends. I know 20 of them in real life, right? They're not my friends, right? But they have the title friend on Facebook, so maybe they are friends because Facebook defines that term now, right? But in any event, the idea is that if you're just saying we're friendly with each other, okay. You're just friendly with the person, they're friendly with you. If you're talking about something that's more substantial, the type of person that you confide in, right? As we said, friendships aren't a small thing. We talked about all of the verses of the Quran, right? Ya waylata, right? Woe to me that I took fulanan khalila, that I took that person as a friend. I took that person as a friend, right? Al-mar'u ala dini khalili, the Prophet ﷺ said that man is on the religion of his friend. فَلْيَنْظُرْ أَحَدُكُمْ مَنْ يُخَالِطُ. Then let each of you look and observe carefully who you befriend in that way. And so we'd say when it comes to like your close, intimate friends, you want your close, intimate friends to be upstanding people of belief. That's who you want your close and upstanding, like that's like your intimate circle. The people you confide in, the people you talk to, the people you find comfort with. That's who you want it to be. But when it just comes to like coworkers, colleagues, whatever, you just deal with them with respect. Some of them you're going to like more, some of them you're going to like less, just because maybe some of them are nicer to you at the workplace, maybe some of them are easier to work with, others are, but that's just work, right? And just the same way that you're sort of compartmentalizing, like, okay, this is a colleague. He and I have a completely different way of living in the world. We have different values. We have all these things. I'm not losing my values in working with this person. I recognize all of these differences. But in the workplace, my focus is work. In school, my focus is school. And so, if the opportunity were to ever present itself for me to talk to this person about my values and guide them to something better, I would take it up. If that opportunity doesn't, which it often doesn't, especially in the workplace because of HR policies and everything else, and you just work. Right? You work, you end your day, and that's all you can do. And Allah knows best.
Jazakallah khair to Ustadh Mobeen for spending so much time with us, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala support him and bless his work and what he's doing.